All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good to see you all this morning. Welcome to the campus of Calvin University. My name is Greg Elzinga, and I have the pleasure of serving as the interim president of Calvin University. I'm a 1990 alum, and it is good to be with you this morning. I've always enjoyed coming to these executive breakfast series, but now I come in a little bit different capacity. So it's my honor to welcome you here this morning. To our team members, Calvin Event Services, the Prince Conference staff, you may notice that this room, if you haven't been in here, looks a little different. It's a little updated. New screens, new lights, some new features, modernize it a little bit, so we're really pleased and thankful for all the folks who make these gatherings possible, so thank you very much. And to the organizers of the event, combining the talents of the Calvin Center for Innovation in Business, which continues to do amazing work in supporting not only our business students, but more of our students across the campus. And thank you for continuing this legacy of excellent programming for executives. And to our guests, for each of you, we sincerely appreciate you taking the time to be here. We know you have full schedules, so we don't take it lightly that you devote some of your time to be with us here this morning. You're valuable partners for the university, and we see all that you do to support our students and our mission. So thank you very much for that. Please join me in prayer as we get going this morning. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this new day. We thank you for the opportunity to serve you through the gifts and talents and experiences that you've given to us, for the opportunity to serve others through each of the different work that you give to each person in this room. We thank you for this gathering, for the food, for the opportunity to hear about the future of solar energy. Lord, we thank you for the chance to hear from our speakers, Jeremy and Jeffrey. Inspire their words to us, as the future of everything is in your redemptive hands. We put our hope and our trust in you. And we ask all this and we say this in Christ's name, amen. So this is an exciting time at Calvin. If you're a regular around campus, you see that there's quite a few construction projects going on, some that are visible, such as the outdoor athletic fields, others that are not quite as visible, such as the renovations going on in 3 floors of our Heckman Library. That's going to be phase 1 of what we call the Commons Union. That's a campus union. It's a gathering space for all of our primarily students, faculty, and staff, but also anyone who might come to visit Calvin's campus. So those 3 floors are going to be completely transformed into student-focused space, focus on academic and what I would call non-academic support services, things like Career Center, Campus Ministries, the Office for Student Success. So those services has historically been located in several places throughout campus, and now we're going to put them all throughout 3 floors in the library, and we're going to join those floors together through a nice big staircase that's going to connect the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor. For many of you, you may know that students study much differently today than they did 20 years ago. So for anyone that remembers Calvin with study carrels, the really only time those study carrels are used by a few people is during exams. What most students like to do is gather, quite honestly, around a table like this in a coffee shop with earpods in, and they are alone doing their own thing, but they're together in community doing it. So we want to make sure we have space that really serves our current and future students really, really well. So the School of Business, a lot of great things happening as well here at the School of Business. It's hard to believe it's just over a year and a half, 2 years since we dedicated this amazing facility and the programming that it represents. There's a lot of buzz about the new 4 undergraduate majors that have been launched: financial planning, operations and supply chain management, business analytics, and entrepreneurship, along with our Calvin Startup Garage, which is really helping not only business students, but other students throughout our campus community who have a dream or a gift for starting a business. So we're very grateful for the work and support that's coming through our Calvin Startup Garage. We also have updated our MBA program after extensive strategic planning. The curriculum is focused on innovation and leadership. The program includes analysis of real companies and valuable interactions with working professionals. So learners have the option to focus in one of our 4 areas, which would be finance, marketing, applied communication, and nonprofit management. And then we're phasing in the curriculum and format now through the September of 2025 timeframe. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers this morning. I'd like to introduce first Dr. Jeremy Van Antwerp, who will be facilitating our program this morning. Jeremy is a professor of engineering here at Calvin University. His specialties include chemical engineering, sustainability, and innovations in engineering education. Jeremy received his master's and doctoral degrees from chemical engineering from the University of Illinois, Fighting Illini, and his BS from chemical engineering from the Honors College at Michigan State University. So you're kind of torn between the Spartans and the Illini. But for the tournament, by the way, I picked the Illini for the tournament. So, anyways, in addition to his teaching and advising here, Dr. Van Antwerp holds the patent for a fast model predictive. How do you say that word? What is that? Ellipsoid. There we go. Control process. And has published numerous journal articles and book chapters. He's also co-authored a publication with his Calvin colleague, Dr. Matt Hune, entitled A Framework for Sustainable Thinking. He also has the distinct pleasure of job sharing his chair at Calvin with his wife, Dr. Jennifer Van Antwerp, today. So we're honored to have both of you here this morning. Today's speaker, Calvin grad Dr. Jeffrey Christians, would like to thank Dr. Van Antwerp, both of them, and Dr. Hune for their important roles in his life at Calvin and beyond. Dr. Van Antwerp will tell you a little bit more about Dr. Christian. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeremy Van Antwerp.
Thanks, Greg. Jeff Christians is the youngest of 4 children. His sister Holly is the oldest, and his brothers John is 15 years older than Jeff, and his brother Matt is 2 years older. Matt teaches at Rockford Christian School, and John teaches at Grand Rapids Christian High School. In fact, John taught Jeff chemistry when Jeff was a student at Grand Rapids Christian. So when I had Jeff as my student here at Calvin, hearing him describe parent-teacher conferences between his brother and his parents was greatly amusing to me. And my wife and I also have kids that are 15 years apart, and maybe that can happen for us someday too. So Jeff, have you had any students yet? We in the Christians trifecta have Matt as a teacher at Rockford Christian, John as a teacher at Grand Rapids Christian, and you as a teacher at Hope. 2 of the 3, but one that's in the running for the Triple Crown. Okay. Jeff was a chemistry and a chemical engineering double major here at Calvin from 2006 to spring of 2010. And he went on to get his PhD and master's degree at Notre Dame. Finished there in 2015. In fact, Jeff is the 3rd of 9 Calvin chemical engineering students that have gone on to Notre Dame's PhD program in less than 20 years. So there is a fun and mutually beneficial pipeline there, and Jeff is an important part of that. After Notre Dame, he spent a couple of years at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado as a postdoctoral researcher. Since 2018, Jeff has been an engineering professor at Hope College, both teaching and continuing his research on solar photovoltaic panels. And over that time, he has published an average of 6 publications a year and has gained almost 11,000 citations to his work in that 6 years that he has been at Hope. So Jeff's been a prolific researcher, and his work is getting lots of important attention. So we would love to have Jeff teaching here at Calvin, and Greg, let's find a way to make that happen. Today, Jeff is going to talk about the future of solar energy. So let's join together in welcoming Jeff to the stage.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. I'm realizing I was supposed to get a lapel mic, and I don't have one, so I'll just use this one, but I think we should be good. So, yeah, we do have one unlucky person who's currently a freshman at Hope. But he's not enrolled in any of my classes, but we'll see if we can get him, and he'll be the first for the real trifecta. So apparently my brothers haven't scared him away, or hopefully not injured him too badly. But as Jeremy said, I'm a Calvin grad, graduated in 2010, and that was a really impactful experience in my life, being at the type of place that really cares for students like what Calvin does. Now, unfortunately, maybe you see the color scheme of my presentation. Yes, there's a little like Hope College logo hiding there, but we'll keep that hidden. We don't have to maybe talk about that. We'll just let it be. But maybe I'll still keep the color scheme just as a little reminder of where I am right now. So when I was at Calvin, one of the things I got really excited about with engineering and chemistry was energy. And I don't really know why. I tried to think back, like what was I actually thinking as an 18, 19, 22-year-old that ended up working in solar energy, and why did I do that? And I don't actually have a great explanation. I just knew when I got and started applying for PhD programs, energy research was the coolest thing. That's what I wanted to get into. And I think as I've really lived in that space, one of the things that's kept me there is this chart. So I like to share this. This is a chart from a few years ago from ExxonMobil, and I think it shows why energy matters to everybody. And I think why energy is one of the most impactful things that we can think about as humans, why we need energy. So what it's showing on the plot, on the y-axis, so as you go up the chart, is the Human Development Index. So basically, like, which countries would you want to live in? And on the x-axis, as you go across the bottom, is energy use. So the countries on the left don't have a lot of energy and are all places you wouldn't want to live. The countries on the right have lots of energy and pretty much are all fine. And you can see it's basically a straight line. There's no country in the world that has access to lots of energy for everyday citizens that is a terrible place. There's no country that doesn't have energy that's just a beautiful place to live that you would want to move to. So if we're thinking about how do we promote human flourishing, I think one of the most impactful ways is expanding access to energy. But of course, that doesn't have no consequences, right? So this was an article that I saw just a couple days ago about cherry blossoms in Japan. Maybe doesn't mean anything, but the Japanese cherry blossoms, they're beautiful. They've been tracking actually when peak cherry blossom season is for not just like hundreds of years, but really for over 1,000 years. So we have data back to 800 for when the peak, 812, for when peak cherry blossom time is during the year. And what you see, of course, is for a lot of years, for most of that time, it bounces around every year, but it's pretty much the same. You can see that solid line is the average. And then, lo and behold, something happens around 1900, and that starts shifting earlier in the year. And of course, that's global warming, right? So this is one of the things about energy is the ways that we have historically produced energy produce a whole lot of emissions. And I think something that maybe people like me appreciate, but maybe normal people don't, is how fast that has changed. So emissions from 1950 are about 1/7 of what they are today. So when we're talking about climate change, it's not where we're currently at, it's how fast we're driving the ship towards the iceberg, kind of, right? So it's, when you're thinking about this, when you're thinking about emissions, so somebody like me, I'm 36, I just had a birthday, about 60% of all of the emissions ever have been in my lifetime. If you're thinking about somebody, so my parents are in the audience, I'm really thankful that they came. If you're thinking about somebody kind of my parents' age, it's almost 90% of all of the emissions ever have been in their lifetimes. So it's this rate of change that is really worrying. And what needs to happen is we need to slow the ship down a little bit so that we're not changing things as fast, right? Where we're at currently in the world is probably okay, but where we're headed, we're going there really quickly. And we're making changes globally really fast. So there's this kind of competing thing between we need more energy, we want more energy because it's really important for all of us. And it's especially important for people that don't live here in the US where we already have that. But we have this kind of competing thing with, what we're doing to the global environment that's making kind of everything a little bit more difficult, especially for people who are less fortunate than many of us are. So another chart just to kind of maybe drive this point home. So why energy use is so important. So these are the total energy use in a year for people in several different countries. So you can see Ethiopia, Tanzania, Liberia, Nigeria, all of those countries, the normal person uses less energy in a year than what my refrigerator uses. So you can see, like, even a pretty basic refrigerator, and actually I kind of lied. So this is an average refrigerator. Mine is a little bit bad. I went and looked on specs. That would be my refrigerator, which is an Energy Star refrigerator, right? I'm an energy person. I have an Energy Star fridge. And it still is like, almost 10 times what people are using in an entire year in some countries. So you can see just how dramatically that would change your life if you didn't have a refrigerator because you couldn't power it and you didn't have power for much else. So that's where I think my kind of continued interest in energy has really sat, because I think one of the things, we feel it when the power goes out, but that's pretty rare and happens for a couple hours or maybe a day, or if it's a really bad storm, maybe 3 days, and then we really feel it. Right? But when that's just the everyday life, you're talking about not just families, but also businesses and industry, and how do you actually power all that stuff? It's still there. We'll keep it hidden. So the type of energy that I work on is solar energy. So solar energy, one of the things that you have to know about solar energy is how fast the world has changed. So I like to show this plot. So this shows solar energy over time versus how people thought. So this is a little bit of a complicated plot, so I'll explain it. The orange line there is how much new solar energy is being installed globally. And all the little blue lines are projections, for future projections from each year. So if you look at, say, one of the blue lines sticking out the middle, we had made that much solar energy and we had kind of predicted that it was going to stay pretty much flat, maybe go up a little bit. But then the reality was solar energy jumped a bunch. And then the prediction was, well, maybe it'll kind of stay there. And then the reality was it jumped a bunch. And this projection goes to, I think, 2020. And you can see in 2020, okay, we're starting to learn. We're assuming from 2020 that kind of top blue line is going to be what's next. So we installed actually a lot of solar energy in 2020. And probably, the market is saturated. There's not that much more space. We're not building new stuff, so it probably is going to stay a little bit flat. So what happened in 2021? So now sitting in 2024, we can look back at that. So 2021 was actually up there. So we had predicted it was going to be stuck there around maybe 120 gigawatts. It was 183. Surely that's as high as it would go, right? But we're sitting in 2024, so we can look, where's 2022? 2022 was way up there. Surely that's as high as it can go. So where was 2023? So I actually have to move my chart down, and I almost am off the screen. 2023 was 437 gigawatts. So this is really if you came to this presentation and I were giving this presentation, say 5 years ago or 6 years ago, the change in that 5 years has been really, really dramatic. Where are we headed now? Or I guess let's give context. So imagining not a whole lot of engineers, I know some that know what a gigawatt is and have like maybe some mental picture of that. So just to give an idea, so I live in Holland. So Holland has pretty much, the city of Holland is like its own separate electrical grid. So Holland, 30,000-ish people. Just to give a sense of that, So Hope College would use about 0.004 gigawatts for like Hope. Calvin's probably about the same. The city of Holland is maybe like 0.2. So not very much. So 100 gigawatts, 400 gigawatts is a lot of power. We've only ever, as a world, installed about 100 gigawatts of coal in a single year. So 400 gigawatts of solar, like that's, even on a global level, that's a lot of energy. A lot of new power, a lot of new projects coming online. That was back in 2015. So we're installing like way more solar than anything else today. More solar than we've ever installed of anything else. Which is, I think, kind of maybe an interesting point. Like we've never in the history of humans installed this much of any kind of power generation. And that's where we already are in solar. We can look at that in the US. So if we look at the US, this is a map of where we're going to be installing new stuff in 2024. So new power generation that's going to come online. All the yellow dots are new solar projects. So you can see it's actually, there are more than what you can even see because there are a whole bunch of little tiny ones that you probably can't see from where you're sitting. And there are also a lot of big ones, but you can see yellow dots all over the place. So right now, the new power generation that's being built here in the US, about 80% of it in the next year will be solar, which is, I think, kind of surprising, right? If I were giving this talk 5 years ago, that would not have been the case. If I were giving the talk 10 years ago, there would have been a couple yellow dots. And now it's yellow dots everywhere. So what's really driven this cost? So this is supposed to be the future of solar energy, where things are going. I'm going to give a little bit of context. But I think one of the most powerful things that has driven this change, the most powerful thing that's driven this change, is this chart here. So this is again, sorry for all these charts. But this is solar cost versus how much we're actually installing. So the more you build of something, the better you get at building it. So that we typically call that the learning rate. Not everything has a learning rate where you get cheaper and better the more that you build things. So if you think of something like a home, homes are really like high touch things to build. So it's not something that really gets like, the labor doesn't get cheaper. It's a lot of manual labor. You're still paying your construction workers. There are processes that are speeding up how fast, how easy it is to build homes, right? We're not like hand pounding nails and, having a hand plane to get all the boards right. So there are real efficiencies that we're building into home construction, but not in the same way as something that's like a product that we can manufacture like a solar cell. So for solar cells, what's happened, since the very early time, so the first solar cell, the first like modern one was in the 50s. Since that time, we've gotten a lot better at it. And that's driven down costs. And we've really gotten better throughout the whole value chain, from mining all the way to production. So you can see the last little while, from like 2000 to 2009 on my chart, everything kind of flatlined. So some of you may remember Solyndra. Have anybody heard of that? So Solyndra had a great business model. They were going to be cheaper than silicon, and they were in 2009. So they were kind of operating under, solar hasn't really changed much in the last year. Maybe this is as cheap as silicon can get. And then unfortunately, silicon got a whole lot cheaper real fast. So that's really the kind of the tipping point, 2009, 10, where people started actually installing this commercially. So capitalism took over, we started to build more of this stuff, and it continued to get cheaper again. So we really got back on that learning curve, and you can see drove the cost down from like $10. So this, again, to put things in context, like a solar panel that you would see on a roof would be about 500 watts. So that would be like $5,000. Drove it down to the lowest number there is in 2020. You can see it's starting to kind of flatline again, but actually it goes back down. So today you can buy a solar panel. What was $5,000 in 2010 is like $60, $70. And that's really what's driven this huge revolution in the field. So we're actually, from 2009, we're not on this learning rate where we get maybe a third cheaper every time we install twice as much. We're actually on maybe even a steeper slope. We're not sure exactly, of course, how far down that's going to go. But where we are already, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that people like me are doing that we think can keep us going at least a little bit further down than this. But we're already at the point where solar panels are incredibly cheap, right? Things that, especially if you look back at like the 70s when Jimmy Carter installed the first solar panels on the White House, those were like gold. Those were so expensive, each one. And now we're talking about things that you can get some places in the world at the grocery store for, $100. So just a pretty dramatic change. So the future of solar. So I guess I have a couple different points that I want to talk about. So the first one, solar will become the most important energy source in the world. I'm pretty confident in that. This is what we're installing. This is where we're getting new power. There are a number of reasons why I think that's true. I'll talk about some of them. The second one, we'll talk a little bit about how far costs can fall, and then we'll kind of mesh 2 and 3. Some of the new technologies that are coming, things that like people like me in the lab, startup companies, what types of things that folks like us are working on that can hopefully keep that cost curve falling. Talk about land use. So obviously one of the big things in solar is like you have to put it somewhere. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that. And then something that I'm kind of excited about, number 5, like what new stuff does this actually enable? So this change is happening, but like how can this, what new things can we do? How can this enable new industries? How can this enable new development? How can this enable new and better stuff into the future? So the most important energy source. So it's already in a lot of countries, not every country. In a lot of countries, though, it's already the cheapest source of bulk energy. So solar, obviously, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but there's this thing called nighttime that does happen. And there are clouds, right? We've all been to Michigan. But when the sun is out, solar is the cheapest game in town because there's no fuel. The panels are really cheap. And the investment in that kind of shows this. So this chart is some of this is total investment in kind of this energy transition that we're going through, which is not just solar, but kind of all renewables. A lot of that is solar. I showed you kind of how quickly solar is rising. It'll rise in 2024 about 30% more than what we installed. We'll install about 30% more in 2024 than what we did in 2023. And it's not clear exactly when that will stop. It will start to plateau, I'm pretty sure in that. Like it's not going to keep going up forever. But exactly like how high, nobody really knows. There are people that guess and people that do a lot of important analysis, but a lot of them have kind of undersold things in the past. So we'll see. But really, this just shows like the amount of money that's actually being put into this is, real dollar amounts. And I think this chart really helps too for me. If you look at fossil fuel investment versus low carbon, which a lot of it is solar, we're investing about the same amount in both of those. So this is where the money is going. This is where some of the new business opportunities and things are happening. And this has really been, as you can see, a shift in just the last couple of years has been where the pendulum has started to swing. So costs have dropped as performance has improved. So this is a lot of kind of really cool science and engineering behind this, and a lot of just kind of cutthroat economics. So solar has become what we call commoditized. It's like, I don't really care if I buy solar from company A or company B or company C, just give me the cheapest one. So that's really driven a kind of a cutthroat market. If you're in the market of producing solar panels, good luck. There's not a lot of profit to be made. There's incredible competition. But what that's done for everybody else is it's driven down costs really incredibly while we've been driving up performance. I think sometimes in the US, we don't see this quite so much. So maybe, so this is, hasn't always translated to cheaper project costs, especially in the US. So we see that it has, these are costs for residential systems, like if you wanted to install one on your roof, or if you wanted to install one on your business. Maybe some of you have solar, maybe some of you have gotten quotes for that. Or if you wanted to install this in, like, say you bought a big field and you wanted to install a whole bunch of solar panels. We have seen costs driven down in the last 10 years, but not that much, especially the last couple years, where panels have still been getting way, way, way cheaper. And that's, I think, one of the kind of interesting things to think about. So that hasn't been true everywhere. So that little line there is what Australia has for residential solar. So Australia, there are parts of Australia where literally 50% of houses have solar panels on their roofs in southern Australia. Obviously, Australia, beautiful sunshine, but part of what they've been able to do is simplify things and get those costs really, really low. If you look at the kind of the colors in the bars, the actual panels themselves, the things that you think cost a lot, in the US, that's maybe 15%, 20% of your system costs. So that's been one of the things that a lot of researchers have really focused on is okay, so if the panels actually are cheap as dirt and they're not part of the cost, how can we continue to drive down like system costs? So that's where people like me have thought a lot about it. So especially true of residential systems. We'll talk maybe a little bit about that. Be happy to answer questions about that. But you can see the kind of that little inset on the top. That really big yellow bar is what we call soft costs. So where the costs are for a solar system today in the US is things like permitting, customer acquisition, it's those types of, it's financing, it's those types of costs that are really a much bigger piece of the pie than the panels themselves, which is kind of makes it interesting if you want to think about how do we actually make these things cheaper. It's in part make the panels cheaper, but that doesn't really do a whole lot. We can make the panels half as cheap. Let's say we do that. You cut costs by like 5%. But if we can streamline things, if we can make things work smoother, that's where, here in the US especially, that's where there's a lot of kind of hay to be made. The other thing that people like me, so who maybe don't have the ability to really work on the soft cost area, what we've been thinking about a lot is how do we make things better? How do we make things more efficient? How do we get more power from the same footprint? So that's especially important for, like, if you think of, like, I'm putting solar on my roof. If you want to put 10 panels up there, if they generate this much power, that's great. But if you could put the same 10 panels up there and they just give you 25% more, that's free money. You still have to install them. You still have to pay somebody to do that. You still have to permit it. You still have, like, the same roof space, the same brackets that are getting installed in your roof, the same construction labor. You just get 25% free energy. So that's where people like me have focused a lot of our attention recently, is how do we keep pushing the performance higher? So I'm going to show a scary chart. So this is a scary chart. So I did a postdoc at the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. And this is a chart from NREL. I think everybody that goes to and works at NREL has to, you're like contractually obligated to share this chart. So this is the best solar cells of all types in the world. So these are the research scale, like people working in the lab. These are the world records for all different types. So you can see all sorts of different types. And then there's a red line about 2/3 of the way up that I call the efficiency limit. So there's actually when you're on the science side of things, there's a pretty fundamental limit for how good you can make a solar cell. So it's about 33%. So you lose some energy, right? The sun has all different colors of light that are shining on us. That's why it looks white. Some of that light we can harvest, right? We can get our solar panel to actually take and harvest and turn into electricity. That's 33% of that. 2/3 of it we can't. Why? Well, some of it is because it turns into heat. So we all know you go outside, you have a dark color shirt on, it gets warm. That's the energy from that sunlight turning into heat. That still happens in a solar cell. We kind of can't get around it. Well, we can because there are dots higher than 33%, but okay. You have to be creative. And then about a third of it we can't actually absorb. So to actually get around that, you can see those purple dots up there. Well, if you have money, rats. So if you have money like NASA, you can get around a lot of things, right? So if you have money like NASA, you can do, instead of just a normal solar panel, what you can do is you can put one solar panel stacked on another solar panel, stacked on another solar panel, stacked on another one as like a sandwich. And that's able to basically keep how much heat you're actually generating down. So you're able to push the performance from 33%. There are some dots up there around 40%. So you can do that if you're NASA. I had some colleagues at NREL that were working on these types of solar cells, all these purple lines, and effectively what you're doing is growing materials individual atomic layer by individual atomic layer. It's kind of an incredible process. Not something that's incredibly cheap, but cheap enough for NASA because you have to pay a whole bunch of money to put things into space, so you care about performance and weight, cost. If it costs $60 or $5,000, if the $5,000 thing works better, I'm going to use that. So that's what the purple dots are. That's NASA. The blue dots, the ones that are stuck below that 33% line, that's what we use today. That's silicon. And that 33% is a hard limit. And actually probably like realistically, 27, maybe 28 is probably the actual limit that you could get to. And we're pretty much there. We're at about 27. At the full panel level, we've pushed the performance up to about 24 for kind of the most modern things. So we're kind of hitting that ceiling already. So we're kind of hitting the ceiling of we can keep making the efficiency better. So installing 10 panels is as good as what installing 12 was a couple years ago. But we're kind of losing some of those gains. So what people like me have been working on in the lab is, well, how can we make get like the purple things, but how can we make that cheap enough that we could use that on Earth? So that's these orange lines here. So the orange lines, we call them next generation technologies. So that's what a lot of the people, like kind of the research people in the lab that aren't working at companies or sometimes are working at companies, that's what a lot of us have been working on. So these are really cool. I got excited about them when I was an undergrad at Kelvin because you could print solar cells, and I thought that was so wild. You can print these electronics. So we could imagine manufacturing these things rather than kind of traditional manufacturing, which sort of looks like how we manufacture computer chips. That's one of the reasons why we're really good at it, because we make a whole bunch of computer chips. We've gotten really good at those processes, but it's not as easy as printing. With some of these orange things, these next generation technologies, we can print them, and that can mean actually making them flexible. So we can make them on plastic, or we can make them on flexible glass, or like thin pieces of metal. All sorts of different applications. We can make them pretty like that little leaf. That's an actual solar panel. The picture here in kind of the bottom left of that bendy one, those are actually my hands. That's a film that we made. So you can make them and you can make it nice and flexible. And you can kind of imagine, what does that do for where we can put these things and how cheap we can make them and how cheap we can install them, especially. Can we make it kind of easier for everybody? And you can also see we've been getting a lot better at these orange ones. You can see those dots going way up with time. So when I started in 2010 really working in solar energy, everybody was really excited. Remember, we had a little light that went on in grad school that we would put on when everybody was celebrating. We called it the baller status light because somebody was like, oh, awesome. When you set like a new lab record at like 3%, right? 3% is not very good, but it was good at the time. Now, with some of these next generation technologies, that's one of the dots there. We're up really competitive with silicon in a performance standpoint. And actually, what we've been able to start to do is start to mimic some of these solar cells that we use for space, but make them from silicon and some of these next generation technologies. This, I have to point this dot out. So this dot, it looks meaningless, but that's one, I didn't make that one, but I was in the room where it happened. So that's a cell, we actually measured it on St. Patrick's Day, so that was a cell we nicknamed Patty, that my group at NREL, one of my colleagues made, and I was kind of part of that work. So I'm pretty proud of that one. But now we're up pretty competitive with silicon, and actually we've started to be able to make some of these, what we call multi-junction solar cells, that we can start to actually get above that red line. So this was kind of a big development for the field. The first pretty commercially accessible cell that you can see is actually, we've squeaked above that 33% line. So really kind of an exciting time. We've not only been able to match what present technology can do, but we've been able to use some of this cheaper stuff to hopefully get a little bit higher. So what are these things? They're called perovskite solar cells. This is what I've spent a lot of my time working on. These are two images from some companies that I know people that are working at. On the left is Oxford Photovoltaics. So they have the world record for like a full-size cell. So like the cell that you see that person holding, that's what you would take and kind of wire together to make a full panel. So they're up, again, the record for kind of present day technology is like, the world record is 26, they're up at almost 29 for the same size, same footprint thing. So we're starting to kind of beat the current players. The other image is tandem PV, which just kind of shows a little bit why we can start to beat these other players, because we're really stacking two solar cells, one perovskite on top of present day commercial technology, a silicon cell. And that allows us to use light better. We can use more of the energy from it, because the perovskite cell can use, you can see kind of most of the rainbow gets eaten up by the perovskite. So that's like our first pass. We get that, we use it really well. And then the stuff that's left over goes to the silicon cell, and that one works great and can use the kind of the remainder. So we're able to kind of split it and use each section of light better. We're able to use most of the colors really well in the perovskite, and kind of the reds and infrared really well in the silicon. That's what allows us to kind of bump above the 33% mark. So what are the problems? So people are, you can see, I guess those are two companies that are both working in the field. There are a number of others. There are starting to be like semi-real sized installations happening around the world. I think the first one of like 11,000 panels was in China pretty recently, just last year. But they're still difficult. So some of the work that I'm doing and some of the work that many others around the world are doing is working on durability. So this is kind of still the reason that you can't buy one of these yet is durability. And the challenge for that, just to give kind of a window into what some of the research community is doing, the challenge is 25 years is a really long time, and that's the current player. That's what they're warranted for. So if you go and buy solar panels really from anybody, they have a 25-year warranty. Some players are starting to offer even 40-year warranties, which is wild. Can you imagine anything being warranted for 40 years? But that's kind of what a lot of solar panels have on them. And if you're developing a new technology, one of the big challenges is how do you actually, if you want to offer a 25-year warranty, cool, you can stick the stamp on it, but how do you actually validate that that's actually going to be true? So that's where this pyramid comes in, and that's where a lot of the research community like me has been looking. Can we start to build toward that stability by first figuring out kind of at this base level, all the materials that we're putting in here have different types of interactions with things like heat and light and UV light, and there are voltages involved, which are fun, and sometimes there's oxygen and moisture and all sorts of things that can cause things to fail. Can we figure out all the different mechanisms and kind of the science underneath? And then can we look at how this translates up into kind of actual real-world operating things? And finally, can we start to assemble these into modules? So just to give a little picture of why this has been hard for the community, these are some cells that a colleague of mine, Aaron Sanahira, made and measured in about 2017. So they started pretty good, and they, in a couple hours under simulated operation, they were terrible, right? So they went from kind of their normal efficiency down to about 50% of their efficiency in like 4 or 5 hours. When we were first starting in this area, this is like, I remember making solar cells back in kind of the same time period, and this was always the challenge, is how do you, like, sometimes it was hard to even measure how well they worked initially because they broke so fast. The super, super early stuff, I remember there was one of the first papers that started this field. They said explicitly in the paper, you got to measure it in the first couple minutes because otherwise it's dead. But they worked really well. So we were kind of interested, what can we do to start to kind of imagine, like, what's actually going wrong? What can we fix? What are the low-hanging fruit? What are kind of the failure mechanisms, and how can we start to patch those? So this is some work that I did from really 2016 to 2018, looking at how we can fix some of these weakest links. So this shows a little bit of the progression that we were able to take then. And you can see the gray line is now hidden because those failed so fast. And now we're looking at that kind of building up step by step from the blue to the black to the orange, the light blue, all the way to the red. So that was work. We improved the lifetimes from getting to 50% in 5 hours to now over 90%, 95% in maybe 1,000 hours. Obviously still not good enough. 1,000 hours is like a month and a half. You don't want your thing failing in a month and a half. So there's still a lot of active research. This is still the biggest problem for the field of kind of this new technology, is how can we get these things to last not 1,000 hours or not 3 years? Can we get them to last 25? And can we know that they're going to actually last 25? And that part is a lot harder than you would think, right? If you're trying to install like a button and you know somebody's going to push this button 10,000 times, you build a little robot arm and you push it 10,000 times, and if it works, it's probably fine. Or you open and close the door handle 10,000 times, a little robot. But solar cells are actually like outside in the wild in all sorts of different climates. And you want to know that it's going to last in Dubai and Atlanta and Alaska. So it's actually really, really difficult. So that's kind of where the research community has. So some of this is some of the new tech that hopefully is coming up, but another thing I want to talk about is briefly is land use. So solar has a big opportunity to increase our energy use with less downsides, so not zero downsides, no energy source. Energy is valuable enough, we should deal with some downsides, but can we have less? And I think the solar energy is a more diffuse energy than fossil fuels or nuclear energy, but is actually pretty abundant. So there's more energy in an hour of sunshine than we use in a year. So we don't have to capture all of it. So the present day utility scale PV, so we have solar panels in the US. They're responsible for a couple % of all of our electricity, and they take up less land than golf courses, like about 1/5 as much land as golf courses. So that's not zero, but it's not the biggest land user either. Even if we said, let's multiply that by 10, let's get more to like 50% of all of the energy that we used, which would be a lot, right? Getting 50% of our energy from solar. We're starting to get kind of in the same land use as, so 5% of corn and soybean farms. Actually, about 50% of corn is used for ethanol that's put into gasoline already. So 50% is used for ethanol, right? When you go to the gas station, you have about a 10 or 15% blend of ethanol in that gas to raise the octane level. That's about half of all of our corn. And about 40% of the rest is used for animal feed. We eat like a tiny little slice. But about 5%, that would be about if we got like 50% of our electricity from solar. So it's a big problem, but it's maybe not as big as maybe you think at first glance. But there's a lot of cool stuff that's happening to be able to make that less impactful, right? We don't want to just cover every field in solar panels. So can we do this kind of more appropriately? And I just have some images up here of ways that that's happening around the world. So on the left, that's a company called Onyx Solar that's really pioneering stuff that looks cool on buildings. So the big tall building there on the top left is a an office building that they've kind of integrated sort of bluish tinted solar panels, so the whole thing looks blue and beautiful, but actually about 50% of the whole facade is solar. The white building below it, actually those white things are solar panels. It's wild. So we can actually make different types of colors, and they still work pretty well. And you can start to put them in places where we already would put other types of things. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really excited about is people are starting to get really creative. Solar's getting cheap enough that we can do things that maybe make it a little more expensive, but it's still kind of the same price as other building materials. You can see on the right a solar fence. So solar panels are about the same price as other fencing materials. So let's build a fence out of it. Solar panels and sheep. Sheep don't mind. They can hang out under a solar panel and eat grass just fine. So we're starting to see kind of new uses. You can see on the top image some solar panels on balconies. So that's actually become a super popular thing in Germany, if anybody's been in Germany recently. I've not. I've never been to Germany. But there are some places where actually a good portion of all of the kind of residential solar energy is produced by people that you buy a solar panel at the grocery store, it has a normal plug on it, and you just plug it into an outlet, and that's the whole thing. You hang it from your balcony, and it reduces your electricity bill. And it costs you $150. So some of these are kind of really changing how we're interacting with it and opening up new ways of doing things, which I think are pretty fun. I've been thinking a lot about buildings and windows, because actually, if you think of cost, installation, permitting, from a materials cost standpoint, actually the most expensive thing is glass. So if we're thinking of integrating into places that we already use all of this stuff, and like we're not taking up new space, one of the places is windows. So I think just to give kind of a perspective, so building energy demand is about 30% of all of the energy that we use is used in buildings. Of that, about half is used for heating. And of that, so the little tiny building is kind of the chunk that's heat that just goes out the window, literally. So it's just totally lost straight out the window. That's actually, in terms of like a slice of the whole energy pie, more heat goes out the window than energy is used by the whole airline industry, about by a factor of 2. So it's actually a huge kind of an absolute value chunk of energy. So one of the things that windows do, obviously, you want to be able to see out them. But if you could make them work as solar cells, you already had to build the building, you have permitting costs, you have installation costs, you have contractors working there. So a lot of kind of the soft cost piece that's so expensive is sort of already there. So it can be a way to kind of improve the economics of a building, even if you're not orienting them perfectly and they're pointed right at the sun. So one of the things that we've been thinking about in my lab is how to do this and what this might look like, say, 30 years in the future. So how can you make a solar cell that's a good window and a good solar cell? Because if you are trying to harvest light, you can't see through it very well, I've heard. So one of the things that you can see in the image at the bottom is people are working on sort of like transition lenses glasses. Can we make solar cells that change color in the same way? You can see this one changes from pale green to dark green. Nobody's going to put green windows on their house. But this is some of the really early work can we start to make things change color when lights so that it can be both a good window and a good solar cell. You can see the little image of one of my lab students in lab taking one of our perovskite solar cells that's nice and brown, and we can actually change the color of that from like dark to clear. And we're hopeful that we could actually do that kind of in a controllable way and do that on demand. We're having even more stability issues than what those already have, and windows are especially hard because the color matters a lot. So I'm not sure if any of this will actually happen, but it's something that's kind of at the really early stages in the R&D labs, where people are starting to think about how can we start to integrate this more seamlessly into everyday life. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is just some of the big challenges. And I know I'm running short on time, so I'll go over these relatively quickly. Obviously, we've heard of nighttime. So nighttime is actually not as big of a challenge as you maybe think at first glance. So batteries have also been on some of the same learning rate curve. So we've been driving costs of batteries down as well. Batteries have fallen from about just in the last like 2 years, fallen from about $150 per kilowatt hour down to like 60, just in like 2 years. So they're on some of this, again, how far will they go? I'm not sure, but they're kind of already at the point where batteries will be able to handle nighttime. And be able to take stuff that's generated in the day, shift it at night, be able to do that cost effectively. Nighttime's not going to be a problem. Kind of a US specific problem actually is connecting things up to the electric grid. Way harder than probably it should be. But actually like putting this stuff in the real world has been challenging. Sometimes can take a lot of money, sometimes can take years. There's a lot of stuff kind of sitting in the pipeline, projects sitting in the pipeline that people are trying to make happen, that part is actually pretty slow. And there's a lot of work to how do we get that to smooth out. One of the same reasons why solar has gotten cheaper, but costs in the US have kind of stuck. The big one, Dunkelflaute. Is there any German speakers that actually can critique my German? So seasonality is the biggest one. It's the biggest challenge for solar. So solar and wind are fairly well matched, actually. So sunny in the summer and windy in the winter. But there are these periods of Dunkelflaute, that's the German word for like the dark doldrums, where it's cloudy and calm. And it can be that way. We know we're from Michigan, right? It can be that way for actually a pretty long period of time. So this is just some data from Germany. You can see kind of the dark color is renewable energy generation, so solar and wind. And you can see there's this big chunk of a couple days where that's missing. That's a problem. And it's a problem that there's not a great solution for. What a current solution is natural gas, fossil fuels in most places. And I think that will be the solution for a while. There's a lot of work going on to try to see, like, can we make another solution? Can we make something cheaper? But that's really going to be, like, it's sunny in the summer and cloudy in the winter, especially places like Michigan, right? Michigan actually has more sun than Germany. We have about 20% more sun than most of Europe, which is kind of wild. The US has a lot of sun, even here in Michigan. But especially if you go to, down south or out west, there's a lot of sun, some of the best actually sun resources in the whole world. But this is still going to be challenging. There aren't great solutions for it, but we can still use a lot of solar before this becomes like the nail in the coffin where we can't install anymore. And there's a lot of cool things happening. I'd love to talk about them to kind of deal with this seasonality, but there's not a great way around it. Here in the US, I think the big opportunity is streamlining things. So this is a quote that I recently got for my house. So I'm in Holland. We have Holland BPW as our utility. And it was both too expensive and pretty small and wouldn't really ever pay itself back. So we haven't, in the US, have really not been able to translate these declining costs into actually declining costs for consumers. We have been at the utility scale. We have been in some areas sort of at the like personal homeowner scale, but not in the way that, say, a country like Australia has been able to do. So that's, I think, a big opportunity. How do we streamline this for American consumers? So the costs are there. We just have to actually figure out, both from a policy side and a technical side, how do we actually do it? I think one of the cool things that's happening is this is becoming, again, it's the most important source of energy. So you're seeing energy growth happening with solar. So this is just from last week. Microsoft had a $500 million project in Texas installing solar for a new data center. So with new power demand, new data centers for computers and AI, companies like Microsoft are being able to actually supply that energy, grow that demand using solar. And I think that's kind of one of the things I'm excited about, both here in the US and abroad. So this is a company, Energia, that works trying to grow access to energy, both domestically in the US and abroad. So they work in Africa and South America and North America as well. This is a project in Africa, in Zimbabwe, at a company called Nimbe Fresh. So this is company Energia basically installed the solar and batteries along with another company, and then has a 20-year lease with Nimbe Fresh to be able to actually lease that power so this company has access to reliable electricity. And now this company is working to actually have farmers in Zimbabwe export fresh produce to the global market. And it's enabled by access to energy, because you need energy to do that. But that's being enabled by kind of this investment of new capital into new energy infrastructure, which is something that I'm pretty excited about. So I think, one of the things that is going to happen is some of these places that are really energy poor, we have a chance to be able to, for less money than what it would take to install a typical full-size power plant, we can kind of piecemeal together in some ways some of that energy infrastructure. Another different opportunity, so this is a bank. This is where actually we bank. It's a bank called Atmos, and what they do is, rather than, for their investments, all their investments are in energy infrastructure. So that's how they get their returns to their customers. So we have like a 3.5% checking account from Atmos, and all of the money that you're putting in the bank is just being invested into solar loans and energy infrastructure loans. And they're making money with that because it's cheap enough now you can make money. So kind of a cool, like, how can we reimagine what some investments actually can look like? And I think one of the exciting things is what's next? What else can we do with extremely low-cost solar energy? How can we take low-cost solar energy and use it to make the world a better place? And I think that's happening, and I think there's just so many exciting things that are happening in the space that I'm really excited about and proud about for the solar community, and I think it's getting to the point where so many others are able to get involved, that I think it's a fun and exciting place to be. So I thank you all for coming this morning and for your attention, and yeah, I think Jeremy's going to come up and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A, and I'd love to talk a little bit more. Thanks.
Just sit down.
All right, beautiful. I got in on a flight at like 11:30 p.m. last night, so sitting down feels good.
So last night I was 2 tables back, and now this morning I was at the front table, and now I'm up on stage. So I guess
Yeah,
after this,
you're moving up in the world.
I have to go through the wall and disappear.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's, tons of interesting information. I think one of the takeaways that I get from this is energy is economic growth. And that's
Absolutely
dovetailing in the information that you've provided and some work that Matt and I have done. So we could talk about that. We could talk about the scientific principles behind what makes a perovskite cell more efficient.
Yeah, I would love that. Nobody else would.
Nobody else would. So maybe you and I can have that conversation later. I think we could talk about some carbon adjacent issues. How do we get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? And but maybe let's talk about the recyclability, end of life issues with solar panels. Maybe that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, sure, we can talk about that. So I think one of the things that, I guess, right, you can't there's no free lunch, right? So that's true of everything, and I think we have to understand energy is valuable enough, that's okay, right? We have power lines all throughout all our neighborhoods. They look kind of ugly, but it's really nice to be able to flip the lights on. Right, nobody likes spending money at the gas station, but sure is nice to have a car. So there's no free lunch, and that's true with solar too. It's lower impact. So if you think of, so if you have a coal power plant, which is what used to be a lot of the energy in Michigan, actually decreasing really fast. So that creates waste too, and actually like solid waste, not just stuff in the atmosphere. If you imagined every solar panel, even if like we keep growing like crazy and we put everyone in a landfill, the amount of waste that you're putting in a landfill would still be less than the amount of waste we have to deal with coal, with the fly ash. So maybe you've driven past a coal power plant, like after you burn the coal, there's still ash left over. A lot of that has stuff that's not super wonderful in it. There's some heavy metals sometimes, depending on where you get your coal from. And that, like, if you just compare, like, even in kind of we grow solar and it becomes giant, even more giant than what it is today. From a waste perspective, it's not as bad, even from a solid waste perspective, as what kind of current stuff is. So it takes up a lot of space, doesn't look like my favorite thing, although sometimes I think on buildings it can look kind of cool. But certainly, yeah, there is some recyclability, so I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that maybe I could talk about happening in both silicon and in perovskite, where people are looking at how can we get this stuff out of the ground and then just let it, once it's broken, we'll fix it and we'll put it back into circulation. That's happening already with the glass that's made for solar panels. So glass, we're good at recycling glass. So that's already starting to happen. It hasn't mostly happened because solar panels last a long time. So they're still out there, right? We installed them 10 years ago, they're still there. So that hasn't been a giant issue, but even if you imagine kind of the 50-year down the line, it's going to be less than what we're currently using.
So if we think about the future of perovskite type materials, and if we go out in the future 100 years or 200 years, are we going to, with these next generation technologies, run into a material resource limitation? Is there a rare element that we're going to run out of if we take this to 1,000?
Yeah, that's great. So there are with some solar technologies. The biggest U.S. company is First Solar. It's in Toledo, Ohio. They use tellurium in theirs, which is a rare earth element. So they can't scale to be they're pretty big. They're the biggest company in the U.S., but they're limited by that. A lot of the perovskites are not. So they're all earth abundant elements. They're all stuff that we are already producing more than what we would need, even in kind of an optimistic scenario. So we would need to produce maybe, I don't know, there are a couple elements that you would need to definitely increase the global supply, maybe 2x or 3x to be able to meet that demand, but it's not like there's stuff in the ground, we would have to get it out.
So the last time you gave an engineering department seminar here at Calvin, we were talking about lead-based perovskite materials.
Still have lead.
Still have lead, okay.
Yeah, so that's maybe one of the things I didn't say. So the perovskites have lead. Lead's not great. We all know like lead paint has a lot of neurological issues that can arise from lead poisoning. So what people have really done is what we try to do is make them as intrinsically safe as possible. So lead's not really a problem. It's getting lead in your body. So if any of you go fishing, right, you take a lead sinker and how do you close it on your line? You bite it. Does anybody else do that? Just me? Like you use lead sinkers. People still have lead plumbing in their homes. That's not great. We should replace that. We should definitely limit lead exposure. But what people have done for perovskite solar cells is we can put encapsulants on them that will bind lead and make it sticky. So even if you shattered this thing and ran a bunch of water on it, none of the lead actually is going to get out into the groundwater. So we've been trying to say, okay, it is going to be something that we're going to have to work on recycling. So we would have to institute recycling programs to actually be able to handle this, kind of like you do the battery in your car, where you turn it in at the end of life and get a new one, and there's some credit system like that to be able to institute a recycling program. But I think in the actual operation in the wild, I don't think it's an actual environmental risk. But it's something that definitely needs to be taken care of.
Bob, do we have audience questions at this point? I can keep talking.
Yeah, no, we've got time for one or two questions from the audience, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Well, I would have a number of questions, but maybe my first question is that where does wind turbines fit into this whole scheme of things? How does that compare to solar, that type of thing?
Yeah, great question. So where do wind turbines fit in? So wind turbines are uglier than solar panels. So if you looked at what are we actually installing? We're installing less wind in the US now than what we're installing solar. Part of that is because they're uglier and people don't like them. So there's a lot of community pushback, I think reasonable community pushback, because you don't want one in your backyard. I think we should install wind turbines still. especially in locations where it makes sense. You have to do that. But the costs haven't fallen as fast. They're not quite as easy to produce. They're like bigger projects, so we haven't been able to make them quite as like manufacturable. You think of like, how TV prices have dropped, that's kind of how solar panels have dropped, but wind turbines haven't been able to drop like that because they're just not quite as like manufacturable. More to install, the material costs are a little bit higher. So you make them cheaper by making them bigger, which makes them sometimes harder to actually put in communities. So I think there's a lot of, like I said, it's windier in the winter and sunnier in the summer. So from an energy perspective, you would want a system that has both. We'll see where the real world happens. But definitely in the real world, solar has dramatically outpaced wind. So solar's way ahead now. Some countries are still installing quite a bit of wind. We're installing some. But it's like more location dependent here in the US. So if you go to, North Dakota, where there aren't very many people, 80% of their electricity is wind. Iowa's over 60%. But here in Michigan, we're less than 10%.
Last question.
Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the transportability of energy? So you have huge solar panels in South Dakota, but the demand is in Chicago. Is there any work looking at converting electrical energy into a transportable liquid, like hydrogen or something like that, to transport? No, hydrogen wouldn't be so good because it's a gas, but.
Yep. A lot of cool things. So one obvious thing is you can put it in a wire and it can go a long ways. It's really hard to build really long wires in the US because actually like natural gas pipelines and big long electrical wires are actually two different things in US policy. So an electrical line is actually a lot harder to build. And kind of we could talk about utilities and why that's a little wild, but you can physically build a 2,000-mile electrical line. They exist in the world. Every continent on Earth has 1,000-mile electrical lines other than the US, or other than North America. There are none in North America, but every other continent has them. So big, long electrical lines is probably the place to start. And then there's a lot of work happening on kind of synthesizing fuels from electricity. So I got in last night. I was just at the American Chemical Society meeting, and one of the talks that I was at was taking carbon dioxide from different industrial processes like cement or power production and turning that directly into fuels using electricity. About 85% of the cost of that is the electricity cost. So something that I think could really be enabled by something like solar. But I think will become a fairly large market where we're actually producing liquid fuels, maybe similar to what we already use liquid fuels for, where we're producing those from electrons from the sun. Instead of growing, crops or something like that, we'll be, getting our liquid fuels from synthesizing them from solar.
All right, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jeff, for being with us this morning. Just interesting to hear all the advances and where solar is headed. So great to have an alum here talking about the topic. So good morning, everybody. Jeff Hoverdink, Director of Alumni Engagement. Just want to thank you all for attending. Before we head out, just a couple of brief announcements here and some reminders. CAP projects. So we are always looking for partnerships with CAP projects. We have amazing students led by incredible faculty who are eager and anxious to help you think about real-world problems in your businesses. So if you are curious to kind of try to crack a nut that you can't quite figure out, you'd like some fresh eyes, let us know. We'd love to partner with you. In addition to that, we also have job shadow programs. So our career services folks have a waiting list of students who are looking to just spend unpaid, brief moments of time with you in your industry. What's it like to be in financial services? What's it like to be in sales? So this is a great opportunity for you to help some young up-and-coming Calvin talent figure out if that industry is right for them. Next thing here to talk about is this is a brand new program. The Global Campus is partnering with Talent First here in Grand Rapids to help employers understand what's involved in bringing formerly incarcerated persons into the workplace. You may have labor shortages, you may have looking for how am I going to fill that role. Well, there is a group of men and women coming out of the prison system who are eager to get back in society. So it's a micro-credential, there's some courses, there's some online training to be done there, so check it out, it's a great program. LeaderCast is coming back May 10. So if you are looking for opportunities to help kind of inspire your workforce or bring some learning opportunities to your team, come back again May 10. Look for more announcements on that. And then from the alumni side, homecoming. It's not that far away. We always used to struggle with what do we plan for Saturday afternoons? Problem solved. Football. So keep an eye out for that. Rumor has it tickets might be hard to come by. We have a ton of interest in this. So coming up in October, 5K race will happen that morning. We're bringing back the corporate challenge. So if you've got 4 or more employees who like to run and you got a little competitive juice in you, we're going to have the corporate challenge for you. And then just lastly, if you want to grab this with a QR code, you can follow the alumni office. We put a lot of info out on social media channels, so take a look at that. Great to see everybody here again this morning. Look forward to a new season in the fall. Have a great rest of your spring. Thank you again for coming, and go Knights.